On behalf of the URBC Organizing Committee, I want to welcome you all to a second in our series of spring seminar series. My name is Marie Journet, and I'm speaking to you from the traditional territories of Squamish Nation. I am very grateful to be living here at the base of Nitchkai, which gives me the opportunity to kind of think about the people who've lived here for so many centuries and the lessons and teachings. So I'm very grateful for that. I'm going to take a few minutes before we get started here just to get us oriented. So today we're going to be focusing on flood risk in the Lower Mainland region. And this session is convened by Steve Litke and Francis Wu, and I'll be introducing them shortly, but I'm just going to take a few minutes to get us oriented to the Zoom platform and give you a little bit of background before we get started. First off, I'd like to thank our sponsors for making this all possible. We're very grateful for funding from Natural Resources Canada and the Canadian Safety and Security Program, from IBC, the Insurance Bureau of Canada, the BC Office of Housing and Construction Standards. EERI is our Earthquake Engineering Research Institute here in Western Canada. BCREA is the Real Estate Association. BGC is a local company that does lots of work in this area, and Engineers and Geoscientists BC. So I want to gratefully acknowledge their contributions to make this all possible. Also want to situate you very briefly into where these sessions fit in the bigger objective of the work we're doing here as part of the Understanding Risk Symposium. This is really, understanding a little bit about the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction and how it could be implemented here in British Columbia. And each of our sessions is going to be addressing some component of this opportunity. It starts with understanding the risk. So we have many sessions that will be looking at bringing new information about earthquake hazards and risk and their consequences to the region. That's kind of the science part of these sessions. There will be sessions that focus on risk reduction. So how we can use some of this information to help us look at choices and consequences. And this is really the policy component, understanding how to take the best evidence available to us and bring it into a policy context. And then the third piece, the third step in implementing Sendai here is really around risk governance. And that's really looking at building our capacity to take this information and knowledge and the plans that have been developed and actually implement them. So that's kind of the roadmap of implementing Sendai at a local scale. And our sessions are really designed to focus on each of these. And we're thrilled today that this session on flood hazards and risk in the Lower Mainland area really showcases each of these components of implementing Sendai in the region. So we will be shortly going to shift our focus to flood hazards and risk in the Lower Mainland region. Looks like we've got a pretty good mix today in terms of roles. We have good representation from the emergency management community, from the engineering community, and from the planning community, land use planning. A few folks from the building, construction, real estate sector, a few folks from the policy side, and good representation from the research community. In terms of organizations, again, a good mix. Most of us are speaking today or representing here today from the Lower Mainland, but we do have people, 22% elsewhere in Canada and a few outside of Canada. So welcome to all of you. I'm going to stop sharing the poll, and we'll shift our attention now to our main show today, which is looking at flood hazards and risk, and more specifically what we can do about flood hazards and risk in the Lower Mainland area. So without any further delay, it's my pleasure to introduce both Steve Litke and Francis Wu, who are convening this session. And I'll turn it over to them for an introduction to the topic they're going to bring forward, the discussion they're going to bring forward, and what we're going to do here today. So with that, I'll I'll stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Steve.
Thanks very much, Murray. I really want to thank the Understanding Risk BC organizers and the sponsors for this opportunity to share some of the work that we're doing to understand and reduce risk, flood risk specifically in the Lower Mainland. I want to specifically thank yourself, Murray, and Daryl, and Susanna, and Jessica, and so many others that are working hard behind the scenes to help plan and convene this series of virtual symposium sessions. And on behalf of the Fraser Basin Council and our many partners in the flood strategy work, we're really pleased and grateful to be part of this. And I also want to thank all of you who have chosen to participate in this session. We really look forward to the discussion over the next couple of hours and listening and learning from your insights and experiences and lessons learned as it might help relate to and help inform some of the work that we're facilitating. The purpose of this session is really twofold. Francis and I will be presenting on a couple different aspects of the flood strategy, and we're wanting to share some of the key findings on some flood hazard modeling and some flood risk assessment work that has been undertaken in the last number of years. But more importantly, we're looking to solicit input on the flood strategy, the vision and framework, as well as some work on the risk profile. So in terms of the agenda, the core of our agenda this morning is to give a couple short overview presentations on the flood strategy and to seek your input and feedback through small group discussions, through breakout sessions. So first, I'll give an overview of the process to develop a Lower Mainland flood management strategy, as well as the vision and framework that's being developed and is evolving to inform and provide some structure to the flood strategy. We'll then go into a breakout session in smaller groups to discuss this topic in more depth, and we'll have a short report back with the larger group. And then for the second part of the agenda, my colleague Francis Wu will present an overview of the flood risk profile of the Lower Mainland, including a wide range of quantitative, qualitative, and other aspects of flood risk and risk reduction that we're exploring through the flood strategy. So I'm going to shift gears now and get into the flood strategy. So the Lower Mainland flood management strategy is aiming to reduce flood risk and increase resilience for communities along the Lower Fraser River and the South Coast. And we're particularly concerned and interested in two regionally significant flood hazards: coastal storm surge, which typically happens in the winter, and Fraser River freshet, which is more of a spring snowmelt flood hazard. This image here is a bit of a snapshot or a satellite image of the region, very complex jurisdictionally, 2 regional districts, 26 municipalities, over 30 First Nations governments, very rich ecologically with respect to salmon, sturgeon, ulakan, the Pacific Flyway, very rich agriculturally, over 200 agricultural products produced in this region, and very significant in terms of Canada's gateway to the Pacific. So a lot of activity, a lot of human development, and a couple of really significant flood hazards. And we're really trying to facilitate a regional approach to flood hazard and risk management. The flood strategy was originated, well, back in 2012, and I want to just very briefly share the phased approach that we've been undertaking. So the province of BC commissioned a cost of adaptation report, and that was released in December of 2012, and that estimated a price tag of almost $10 billion to deal with a meter of sea level rise, largely raising and widening sea dikes. And so a number of the flood practitioners and decision makers we work with felt, well, it's a bit jaw-dropping, and so let's take a proactive planning approach, a longer-term planning horizon to try to get ahead of this, amortize the costs over time, and think through how we're going to deal with not only current flood hazards, but future flood hazards as a result of climate change. We, after consulting with partners and confirming there was interest and support for this, we started small with an initial phase focusing on improving our knowledge base around flood hazards, flood vulnerability, and flood management. Then that really made a compelling case to focus on this strategy. What we found was flood hazards are expected to increase as a result of climate change. We have tens of billions of dollars potentially exposed. that would have really significant economic and other consequences if a large flood occurred in the region. And the existing diking system doesn't offer the level of protection that we previously thought. So we entered into phase 2, which is actually building the strategy. And this is undertaken or involved undertaking a number of technical analyses projects and very significant engagement and dialogue. And we're working towards a strategy for next spring and then moving towards an implementation phase. The Fraser Basin Council is a non-government organization. We have no regulatory role, no decision authority on flood management or any of the sustainability issues that we work on, but that situates us very well to serve as an impartial convener and facilitator and coordinator of this initiative. But the strength is really in the broad-based partnership. Over 50 organizations are participating in this. Federal, provincial, First Nations, and local governments, and a number of private sector and civil society organizations as well. And they contribute funding to undertake the work and support this planning. They have shared data, advice of their staff, and expertise and experiences on the ground. And that's been really invaluable to help shape and inform the flood strategy. And I also want to acknowledge that they undertake a lot of key work within their own jurisdictions, within their own spheres of influence. And there's really two primary approaches that we're taking to develop the strategy. One is around technical analysis and doing more detailed work to better understand flood hazards and flood risk information. And a key part as well, I mentioned, is that engagement and dialogue, engaging with a broad base of perspectives, jurisdictions, disciplines to learn what we can about this issue and some of the institutional challenges and barriers. What can we learn from those that have frontline responsibilities when it comes to flood? So that's all I'm going to say in terms of context. There's been a tremendous amount of work in the background, and we're approaching a draft strategy. We don't quite have that yet, but we wanted to share with you some of the building blocks, one of which is a vision and framework for the strategy. And this will be the focus of our first round of breakout sessions. So why do we need a vision for a flood strategy? The vision is really intended to outline the overarching values, principles, and objectives to be achieved through the flood strategy initiative, both the content of the strategy, but also the process that we undertake. And these values, principles, and objectives can inform different kinds of recommendations that will show up in the strategy around regional priorities and high-risk areas, around what flood risk reduction options are appropriate across very diverse circumstances and local conditions across the region, and also to inform the scope and approach to governance and funding arrangements that will be helpful to implement the strategy once it's completed and supported. And so this is a vision statement. This vision was drafted between 2 and 3 years ago. And so the Lower Mainland is a flood resilient and safe region where people, communities, and organizations work together to manage current and changing flood hazards, risks, and benefits. So there's a lot packed in there. I want to highlight the collaborative approach that we're taking, the view to current and future flood hazards with respect to climate change, but also acknowledging benefits. Flooding is a natural process. Flooding has shaped this landscape where we live and work. And so we don't want to lose sight of that as well. These are the 3 objectives in the vision document, and they are largely informed by the Sendai framework. First is around understanding flood risk and increasing awareness. The second is to strengthen flood risk governance. And the third is to identify and implement flood risk reduction for community and ecosystem resilience. Then there are a number of values and principles that were developed, again, through a collaborative consultative process. And so 4 of those, and these are intended to inform the development of the flood strategy. And there will be a bit of repetition here, some of the themes that I've already been discussing. So one is around considering current and future flood hazards, reducing risk through proactive, preventative, and integrated measures. This work will also support emergency management and response and preparedness and recovery, but we're largely trying to get ahead of a large flood and reduce those consequences in advance. Certainly, it's really critical to recognize First Nations title and rights in the region and their role in implementing, well, designing and implementing the strategy. We're trying to encourage a holistic approach, basically a sustainability lens, looking at social, cultural, economic, and environmental outcomes. We're looking to adapt policies and actions for local and sub-regional circumstances, recognizing the diversity of the landscape and the flood hazards in the region. Also on that regional lens, looking at regional interdependencies. We share some common hazards and risks, and there is the potential to transfer risk if we're not careful and thoughtful about the actions that we take. We might solve one problem, but create another problem for somebody else downriver or across the river. We're looking to inform decisions with different kinds of knowledge, and we're looking to develop and implement actions through collaboration and consensus. So you can see while the focus is on risk reduction, we're really trying to support and facilitate a very broad-based holistic approach to reducing flood risk, so there can be many other community benefits. So now we're at a stage where we're shifting from those original values and principles that were outlined in the vision statement, the vision document, and framing those as desired outcomes. What do we want to achieve through the flood strategy? And so there are 8 in draft at this stage, and this may evolve. We'll be having a number of committee meetings with partners and consulting with partners over the coming months. But right now, this is where we seem to be landing. 8 general high-level desired outcomes, including improving understanding of flood risk, improving regional coordination and capacity, advancing reconciliation with First Nations, improving environmental stewardship, improving social and cultural co-benefits, strengthening resilience of critical infrastructure and lifeline services, strengthening economic resilience, and strengthening climate resilience. And in terms of moving from, well, I guess before I go to the framework, I just wanted to share, these are some examples of the different types of recommendations that we anticipate for the flood strategy. While we won't be recommending top 10 priorities, for example, in the region, we will be have been developing a framework and multiple criteria to help inform prioritization of high flood risk or high risk areas across the Lower Mainland region. And Francis will be talking a little bit more about that. We anticipate recommendations about regional scale flood risk reduction actions, as well as local scale risk reduction actions. There will be some recommendations around regional decision-making and funding. And one of the areas we're exploring is how can we build on existing jurisdictions and where are there opportunities to add value in terms of regional scale coordination and collaboration. And finally, some recommendations around strategy implementation. Just going to do a little time check here. Okay, a couple more slides, and then we'll go into our breakout rooms. I went through the 8 desired outcomes, and really the framework for the strategy that we're currently thinking about is for each of those desired outcomes, what recommendations would help us get there and achieve those outcomes over the longer term? And then what performance measures can we use to monitor and measure progress with respect to implementing the strategy? Are we doing what we said we would do? Is it achieving the outcomes that we're looking for? And I'll just note that the desired outcomes are draft, and the recommendations are pretty general, and they're intended to be illustrative of this framework and the kinds of directions that we see ourselves going. There'll be a lot more detail required in terms of the additional layers of detail with respect to desired outcomes, as well as the recommendations. But I just wanted to share some examples with you. So with respect to improving understanding of flood risk, there'll be some work to continue undertaking flood modeling and mapping. The suggestion has been made to develop a consistent, up-to-date regional floodplain map for the entire Lower Mainland. So that's one example. With respect to advancing reconciliation with First Nations, we're trying to take a collaborative planning approach and moving towards shared decision-making with First Nations governments as equal partners around the decision-making table. So just a couple examples of where we're going there. And then additional desired outcomes. strengthening resilience of critical infrastructure, for example. We've got some more work to do here, and we anticipate working with different infrastructure sectors, such as the transportation sector, to inform priority risk areas of concern to that sector, and to work with them to increase flood resilience of infrastructure and lifeline services. So I'm not going to go through all of the recommendations in the interest of time, and this document is available on a Google Doc to support the breakout sessions. But I think what I'll do now is state the discussion questions and then give you a little bit more instruction with respect to the breakout groups. So we've given you just a real cursory look at the vision and framework, and we're looking to you to share your experiences and advice and feedback. What do you think are the strengths and limitations about the vision and framework that's been presented? And if there is time, in your experience with risk-related work more generally, what makes for an effective vision and framework? Not limiting your thinking to what we've presented, but maybe what you've observed or learned elsewhere. So you'll each be placed in one of 4 breakout groups. You'll have 15 minutes to discuss those 2 questions. I believe there will be a Google Doc link in the chat. And then, so any of you, I mean, that's for note takers, but any of you are able to access and add to that document if you want. And then those last couple slides on the framework are also there if you wanted to refer to that to support your discussion. As I mentioned already, facilitators and note takers will support the breakout sessions in terms of documenting what we can learn from your input and feedback. They'll share their screen at the beginning of the session to show the questions for discussion, and then turn that off so you're able to have some FaceTime and discussion with each other. And we certainly invite and encourage you to turn on your videos to support that conversation. Yeah, so please share with us your best thoughts and experiences and lessons learned. And please also share what limited airtime that we've got, so there's an opportunity for everyone in the groups to contribute. And rather than doing an initial round of introductions at the outset, what we thought we would do in the interest of time is as you're wanting to make a contribution or share a comment, please introduce your name and affiliation at that time. Next up, I'm pleased to introduce Francis Wu, my colleague at Fraser Basin Council. Francis is a program manager with Flood Strategies at FBC in our Vancouver office, which is all our home offices, as it probably is for most of you. So yeah, over to you, Francis.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. So in this presentation, we're going to be moving from the vision and framework to talk a bit about the risk profile for the Lower Mainland, and to be able to use a regional lens in the flood management strategy and help decision makers prioritize areas for risk reduction, we need to first understand where the flood risk areas are. Each jurisdiction, be it First Nation, local governments, or sector-specific groups, will have their own priorities related to local needs and interests. I know that some communities have already done their own flood risk assessments and prioritization. But we know that as a region, flood impacts in one area can affect other areas, including those outside the floodplain, for example, through disrupted services or a flooded highway. And we also know that we have limited resources and need to make sure that our actions, policies, and investments are targeted and strategic. And so a regional flood risk profile can help us see where and how local communities are connected, and also where potential high priority areas are. So in this presentation, I'll be sharing on the process and results of the analysis that's been done to date to develop this profile, and some of the gaps that we're still working to address. As part of the technical work to develop the strategy, the Fraser Basin Council oversaw the development of a hydraulic model and associated mapping for the Lower Fraser River. And this helped us understand where the hazards are, so where and how deep floodwaters would go under various scenarios. So as an example, this is the mapping for a 50-year or 2% AEP flood, and this is the 500-year Fraser River flood. And just a note that the model illustrates where dikes would be overtopped, but it doesn't show dike failures, which could happen before a dike is overtopped. And this has been a very useful tool for engaging on the strategy and also for strategy partners to work on their own projects. But it doesn't provide information about where and what types of impacts would occur. In order to take a risk-based approach that considers both the flood hazard and the impacts, we had to conduct a flood risk assessment. To do this, we started with the values and considerations that have been highlighted through our engagement with flood strategy partners. And you can see how wide-ranging they are. And in some ways, many of these are interrelated. For example, public safety and health means having functional roads so people can evacuate or help can come to the community. It means maintaining agricultural production so people can access and afford food. And so this emphasizes the need to look beyond dollars and damage in favor of a multi-criteria approach. And this is the approach that was taken in the Lower Mainland flood risk assessment. In addition to these, there are other values and considerations that will require further engagement and analysis. And I'll talk more in detail about them later, but I just wanted to highlight the first one, First Nations values, which includes cultural heritage and traditional use values, assets and vulnerabilities within reserves and in traditional territories. We know that this takes time, and in the flood risk assessment, we made a few attempts at engaging and gathering data, including holding 2 workshops with First Nations. But in many cases, there wasn't enough data to cover the whole region, and we realized that more engagement is needed. The idea for the Lower Mainland flood management strategy is that we ultimately arrive at a list of regional priority areas for action. But because there are so many interests across the region, and as Steve mentioned, the Fraser Basin Council plays a facilitator role, and we're not decision makers. At this stage, we'll only be working on identifying risk areas based on different criteria and developing a framework for prioritization, and it'll ultimately be left up to decision makers to develop that list of regional priorities. So I'll talk a bit about the flood risk assessment. This was conducted by IBI Group, and just very simply, the hazard assessment portion of the project included both Fraser River freshet flooding and winter, so coastal storm surge flooding, using 8 likelihoods ranging from the 10-year to the 1,000-year flood. It also estimated annualized damages or average annual impacts based on the probability of those 8 flood events. And in some cases, this can be a more useful measure than looking at a single flood. And a range of exposure and vulnerability data were analyzed and modeled together with the hazard results to estimate flood impacts. And these impacts are grouped into 5 categories, which I'll run through in the next 2 slides. There's a lot of information here, but I'll just focus on the leftmost 2 columns. So the impacts included tangible direct damages, which include monetary damages to buildings and contents, public infrastructure, and agricultural damages, intangible community impacts, which include exposed educational, cultural, and community buildings and archaeological and heritage sites. Social factors like exposed population, including vulnerable populations, environmental impacts, which include locations with the potential for hazardous material release, sewage networks, and sensitive areas. And finally, lifeline disruptions, which looks at inundated roads, emergency health and electrical service facilities. So to represent the risk results in a dynamic way, the consultant created this an online portal, which you can see here, as a tool for the Fraser Basin Council and our partners to do our own analysis. And so there's a couple of things you can adjust on this portal. On the top left, you can select the geographic scale. So that's census subdivision, census tract, or dissemination area. And underneath that, you can select the flood scenario that you want to look at. So that includes both freshet and winter flooding, the 500-year, 200-year, and estimated annual damages. And then across the top, a table where you can weight the various subcategories. It's probably pretty hard to see, but there are those 5 categories with the various subcategories there. So if you're interested in only one type of impact, for example, agricultural, you could weight that high and then weight the others low in order to see the risk related to agricultural impacts. And then below that is a map that visually shows where the higher risk areas are, and then also a table that ranks those areas based on the geography that you choose. And I won't go into the results in detail, but I want to show you a couple of examples of how the scores and ranking change when you make different selections. So the results here are for the 500-year coastal flood using a set of weighting developed at a workshop we held back in March and at the census subdivision scale. And here, the results that you get are that Richmond and Delta have the highest risk score. And then the results here are for the 500-year freshet Fraser River flood with the same weightings and geographic scale. And you can see how some of that risk moves inland. And this is the same flood scenario, but with agricultural damages weighted high and everything weighted 0. So looking only at agricultural impacts. And you can see that the Chilliwack and Nicomen Island area have the highest flood risk when it comes to agricultural impacts. And this is the same thing, but just wanted to show how switching from census subdivision to dissemination area, obviously the larger municipalities are broken up into smaller areas, so that also affects the results. The portal also shows absolute results for each of the impact categories on this bottom table here. It's hard to see the actual numbers, but these absolute results would be helpful for further comparison or for communities to do their own planning. We're also identifying areas where contiguous hazard area crosses jurisdictional boundaries. And this is sort of kind of the heart of the regional strategy, looking at where, hazard and risk cross jurisdictional boundaries. So while this is not risk, it does illustrate where multiple jurisdictions might have to coordinate and collaborate on flood risk reduction actions. As an example, the Nicomen Island area includes several First Nation reserves, the Fraser Valley Regional District Electoral Area G, some agricultural land reserve lands, Highway 7, and the CP rail line. So it's also a good example of how communities are connected and the possible cascading effects that a disruption of the rail or highway could cause. So finally, there were a number of values that we couldn't include in the flood risk assessment, whether for lack of complete data or the limited timeline to properly include them all, especially in cases where further study and engagement would have been needed. But these are things that we still recognize as important, and we'd like to include them as much as possible as we draft the strategy and engage on the strategy. For example, to more fully include First Nations values in the regional risk picture, we're now working with the Emergency Planning Secretariat and Kwanlam First Nation on a flood risk assessment for Mainland Coast Salish First Nations. In terms of equity-based considerations, that includes considering areas that have been historically and currently underserved in terms of flood protection and emergency response measures, and also looking potentially at proportional impacts. So recognizing that an event causing $1 million in damage in a small community could have a larger impact than the same event causing $10 million in a larger, better resourced community, or that the loss of one road could be devastating for First Nation that only has a single road in and out of the community. And in terms of irreplaceable services and assets, things like ecosystems, groundwater quality, or archaeological and burial sites that would either take a long time to recover or can't be recovered at all once damaged or lost in a flood. And then with key regional assets, because their vulnerability can be so much more complex than, say, a single building, there wasn't a simple way to include them in the flood risk assessment. But there might be ways to qualitatively assess the impacts of flooding at these sites. And then the last one is a bit different, response or resilience measures. So that speaks to accounting for flood risk reduction actions, policies, or plans other than diking that could have the kind of converse effect of reducing risk. And how do we take that into account when we look at risk at a regional scale? So through further research and engagement, we might be able to identify and map these values and overlay the information with the quantitative flood risk assessment. And we have some ideas about this, but we're really looking forward to hearing from you about your experiences working with qualitative, intangible, or otherwise harder to measure aspects of risk, and how that could inform our next steps. Yeah, so we have 2 discussion questions. I guess I'll read them out now. So what are some qualitative or hard to measure aspects of risk that you've dealt with in your work? And how did you work to include and represent these? And the second question is, if you have any suggestions for addressing the qualitative aspects of risk for the flood strategy. We would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Let's see. Yeah, once again, we'll have share your best thoughts, share the airtime with others, take the last couple of minutes to review the notes. And we'll certainly invite the note takers to put up the Google Doc so you can refer to the questions at the outset. I'll share a little bit now in terms of our next steps for the Lower Mainland flood management strategy. But I guess before I do, I just want to thank you again for your interest and your participation in this particular Understanding Risk session, and for sharing your thoughts and suggestions with us today. We'll look to include what we heard. We'll download the chat. We've got the notes from you and the recording, and that will be added to the mix of the input that we've heard to date, and we'll continue to be engaging and consulting, especially with the partner organizations over the coming months, but also other stakeholders and some public engagement later in the winter. So this will be very informative as we continue to develop the content for the draft flood strategy. And really, we're on a timeline of putting together that first draft, reviewing it with our technical advisors and senior officials within those partner organizations, and then take that more widely out to get a sense of people's preferences, where there's support, where there may not be consensus, and we've got some more work to do, those sorts of things. You've really given us lots to think about and to consider as we draft that strategy. And I think with that, I will hand it back to Murray.
Great, Steve and Francis, on behalf of the URBC Organizing Committee, I just want to thank you both for bringing such a rich discussion to this community. It was excellent. Sarah has been busy. I've been really enjoying watching her screen. Instead of her image of herself, you can see her screen evolving. And I wondered if Sarah wanted to just kind of share a little bit with us now.
Well, thank you for having me. And I think hopefully I've captured a few of your thoughts and your feedback, and I will be working a little bit more on this after and sharing it with you. But it's been a very interesting and fulfilling discussion to record. That's real. I don't really have much to say.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Sarah. It's always fascinating to see how the conversations are captured, both in words, but also through graphic recording. So we really appreciate that. Moving on to next week, you'll want to make note of these two sessions, Shaping Our Future, looking at how some of the work that's going on in these initiatives might take root in the regional planning efforts that Metro Vancouver is leading on our behalf, thinking about our future in this region. And also the second session on September 29th, really kind of moving the conversation away from the physical impacts of hazards and risk to thinking about the downstream consequences in terms of our recovery, functional recovery. So we want to invite you to those sessions for sure. And then just to stay in touch with us, again, check our website for upcoming announcements. For the upcoming sessions, there's often some background material that will be posted. And with that, we are going to end exactly on time, thanks to the impeccable time keeping of our conveners. I had a yak bell here that I was just waiting to ring, but they didn't give me that opportunity. We kept right on track. And again, thank you, a big thank you to our conveners, to our note takers, to our graphic recorders, but mostly to all of you for making this possible and bringing your thoughts and energy. And with that, I'll wish you a very safe and happy day.